Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Malcolm. I'm a programmer at UCLA Film and Television Archive. Welcome to the latest event in our virtual screening room initiative. We are not coming to you from our year-round home at the Billy Wilder Theater, but we still want to acknowledge that we are present on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongvar peoples. We are humbled to do work in this community. Our program today is presented in partnership with the League of Women Voters. It's a continuation of the series we had to suspend in March, Women to the Polls, a Suffrage Film Festival, which celebrated the ratification of the 19th Amendment and examined through film and dialogue the ongoing fight for universal suffrage in the United States. We're thrilled to return to these themes this week, albeit in a different environment, with the screening of the rediscovered 1917 silent film Mothers of Men, followed by a panel discussion featuring leading scholars and public policy advocates. I want to thank the San Francisco Silent Film Festival for allowing us to include its restoration of Mothers of Men in our program. I also want to give a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles and Professor Virginia Wexman, who has been the driving force behind this entire initiative. We're grateful to all of the distinguished guests joining us here today to introduce the film and for our post-screening conversation. Please do stick around for that. And now I will turn it over to Virginia Wexman.
Thank you, Paul. I want to add my welcome to Paul's on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles, which is co-sponsoring today's event. Please stay with us after the screening to hear a discussion about the film and its relation to issues of today with our panel of experts. To provide us with some background on the film we're about to see, I would now like to introduce Shelley Stamp, Professor of Film and Digital Media at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and the author of Movie Struck Girls, Women and Motion Picture Culture After the Nickelodeon.
Thanks, Virginia. It's a real honor to get to introduce the film to you today. Let me start by saying that I think that everyone involved in the making of Mothers of Men in 1917 would have been shocked that a woman was nominated to run for president on the party of a major political party in 2016. They would have been shocked, not because a woman was the Democratic nominee for president, but because it took 100 years. Mothers of Men was released at a time when the nation was really gripped with the question of equal voting rights for women. And many films were made on the topic, many films about the quest for women's suffrage. Mothers of Men attacks this question a little differently. Rather than make an overt plea for equal voting rights, Mothers of Men jumps into the near future and imagines a world when women already have the vote and already have political equality and already occupy positions of civic leadership, attorneys, judges, even state governor. Right? And where the Women's Party is an influential body in politics. And the film uses a melodramatic plot to embroil its heroine, Clara Madison, in a series of sort of hair-raising incidents that challenge her resolve. So political corruption, misogynist critics, Italian anarchists, and ultimately a death penalty case involving someone very near and dear to her. And so in doing so, I think Mothers of Men poses a series of questions that really still dog female politicians and female civic leaders. Can women provide effective political leadership without their heartstrings getting in the way? Will women bring a stronger moral compass to civic leadership? Can female leadership curtail political corruption? Where do women's allegiances lie? With their families, with other women, with the public good? Are these things mutually exclusive? And so by posing all of these problems around the heroine, Clara Madison, in such melodramatic terms, Mothers of Men insists that women, however powerful in this new future, remain bound by familial ties and by emotional attachments that the film kind of sees as at odds with civic life, right, or public leadership. And it builds a case for the moral superiority of white middle-class femininity by contrasting it with a violent, racialized otherness, as you'll see in the film. And then in imagining this future of political equality, the film ponders another set of questions that I think we still face today. How will the popular press treat women in elected office or running for elected office? How will female leaders handle misogynist attacks that they're going to face? When the film was first released, reviewers suggested that its timely theme would interest millions of women, not just ardent suffragists, right? Reviewers were very keen to suggest that it was going to be of interest to many, many women, not just ardent suffragists. Even still, the film's producer, Hal Reid, was eager to court the favor of suffrage activists. So he screened a print of the film for suffrage leaders on the East Coast and incorporated some of the suggestions they made. Having shot the film in California, where women already had the vote, I think he was really eager to make sure that its message would play to a broad national constituency, including many women who did not already have the vote. So it was initially released in 1917, and then it was re-released in 1921, just a few months after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And for its re-release, it was retitled Every Woman's Problem. This re-release print included a new foreword declaring that women had been newly released from the fetters of inequality by the vote. And so the far-flung future that was imagined in the 1917 release was now a much more tangible reality in 1921. But every woman's problem, the battle between the heart and the head, still threatened to compromise women's engagement in civic life, right? And so, I feel like how much of the rhetoric surrounding women in politics and women in public life has actually changed over the past 100 years. These are still questions that we're grappling with. Now, both versions of the film, the 1917 version and the re-release in 1921, were long presumed to be lost, but they were rediscovered by film archivist extraordinaire James Mockoski in 1997. And he recently restored the film in partnership with the British Film Institute and the San Francisco Silent Film Festival. And so I'd like to invite James to tell us a little bit more about the restoration of the film and the rediscovery of the print.
Thank you very much, Shelley. I appreciate the kind words, but I'll be honest, it was Shelley who made this all happen. And I wouldn't be here, this film wouldn't have been discovered without her help back in 1998. I was a student at UCLA, UCSC, and she was my advisor, and I had studied with Shelley in her silent film class, and she inspired me to learn about silent film. And I had learned about the local film studios that Santa Cruz had to offer at that time. In that research and at that time, I had discovered Mothers of Men was a film that had been made in Santa Cruz. And I went through researching, trying to find if any prints existed. And it just so happened that the film, the only known existing copy of it was at the British Film Institute. How could this be that one of our suffrage film that was made here in the US wound up across the seas at the British Film Institute? And it's so fortunate that the British Film Institute took their time and energy to preserve our history. And I appreciate, and our big thanks should go out to the British Film Institute for preserving this film. So after UCSC, it took me about 16 years to come back to find my way back to Mothers of Men. I worked at UCLA in the preservation department, and then back to San Francisco to work at American Zoetrope, Francis Ford Coppola's company. And in that time, I said, I feel that we had started something in Santa Cruz with Shelley, that I wanted to go back and find a way to preserve this. And it seemed that 2015, 2016, when we had this discussion, it seemed that the time was right. So I had approached the San Francisco Silent Film Festival, who's starting to work on preservation themselves, and Stacy Wisnia and Rob Byrne. A big shout out goes to them because I couldn't have done it without their help. Rob took the great care and energy to preserve, to do the restoration, and I helped with a lot of the stabilization, but Rob really did the nuts and bolts of cleaning up the film. And so I think that the work that the San Francisco Silent Film Festival should be recognized. They do an amazing job. And we're here again because of Shelley. We're here because of the San Francisco Silent Film Festival. And in 2016, when we debuted it, we found the original score, but a group called the Mont Alto Orchestra in Colorado came about and helped put sound back to the film. Now, we say that these are silent films, but they're not really silent. They were never meant to be silent. They were meant to have sort of improvisation or score. People, theaters had musicians that they hired to play along with the film. So it needed to have a voice. So Mont Alto, you'll hear tonight, orchestrated, wrote the score for tonight's film. And I thank them for doing that for us. Also, part of the restoration is, we think of silent films, we think of they're black and white and scratchy and dirty and all. The people have sort of this connotation, but they're not. Back then, great love and care was done for the for presentation of the film, and a lot of these films were colored, tints and tones. But unfortunately, that aspect of film preservation was lost over the time. It was easier and cheaper to do black and white transfers of films. And so when people think of black and white is because of that work was done to preserve transfers to black and white, but lost the color. So modern technology has been able to look at what was done for the original presentation and recreate these beautiful tints, beautiful tones. And when Rob and I went to the British Film Institute, we discovered that the print that they had beautiful tints. They were gorgeous blues, pinks, oranges. What was done in 1917. And this is the first time that we were able to present the film as it was originally intended to an audience in 1917 and 1921. Now, what is also interesting that I think is fitting that we're here today it was great. We're in a great period, and I think this is a good time to commemorate the fight for suffrage, the ratification, the bringing the 19th Amendment. It's such a great time to come back to see what they had done 100 years ago with the films. It's unfortunate that there's not many suffrage films that survive. Mothers and Men is one of the only films that really discuss the suffrage movement. There's others, but there's not many that survive. So it is great that 100 years that Mothers and Men still lends a voice. It still can move the discussion, and I'm glad we're here tonight. It is very fitting that the League of Women Voters is here tonight because, in 1921, they just recently at that time had started their organization. And there's great articles that when the ratification, the 19th Amendment happened, it was a good moment to re-release Mothers and Men under the new title that Shelley had mentioned, Every Woman's Problem. And they released it in New Jersey. And the League of Women Voters at that time, starting on the East Coast, had participated in this re-release. They were right there, right at the very beginning, using Mothers and Men as part of bringing the cause of women, the rights for women to vote out there. So the connection, I see it's very fitting that we have them here tonight, 100 years later, to join the discussion again. And I thank UCLA. I thank Paul for inviting me here tonight. And without further ado, I think we need to get back into the film and see what we're going to see tonight. So I appreciate having this discussion, and I look forward to tonight's discussion with Virginia and everyone. So thank you very much. And I turn this back over to Virginia.
Now, Mothers of Men. I'll be back with our panel discussion after the film. Hello again. I hope everyone enjoyed the film. Let me begin our discussion by introducing the participants. Shelley Stamp, you've already met, but we also have Ellen Dubois, Professor Emerita of History at UCLA, and the author of the just published Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. Then we have Belinda Robnett, professor of sociology at the University of California at Irvine, who had just moved to the University of California at Santa Barbara. She is the author of How Long? African American Women in the Struggle for Civil Rights. Finally, Virginia Kase, executive director of the League of Women Voters of the United States. And Virginia is in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to start by, you've already heard from Shelley Stamp. We'll have brief statements from the other participants, beginning with Ellen.
Hi, this was a really interesting movie. I've seen a few others of the pro-suffrage pre-1920 movies, but never this one. 1917. So although the 19th Amendment has been ratified, women are voting in actually now including New York, probably something like 6 million, maybe 20% of women in the United States are already voting. What's interesting is that the book does not address questions of whether women could vote. It obscures that. What it addressed is women running for office, which is not something that the suffrage movement did. It really didn't do that. It didn't. Its purpose was not even the League of Women Voters. The purpose was not to get women to hold office. In part, you could see from this movie, because women were seen to be both sort of too vulnerable to the corruption of elections, and that if they did get into politics, they'd lose the kind of moral superiority that was hoping they'd do politics. So this is a very, very interesting move in going in that direction. There's one other thing that it raises, which is also very unusual. And this is that she's married. And I have to tell you, I don't know about the actress, but to me, she looks like she was getting pregnant while the thing was being filmed. She looks like she's getting a little thick there. But the notion that women get married and she's going to have a baby, and there's no indication that she's going to stop being governor when she has the baby. So the idea of women both holding jobs and being married was really too modern for the feminist movement in this period, and certainly for women in politics. That makes this film very unusual.
Linda, what would you like to say for the outset?
Oh, okay. I'll raise the other thing later.
No, you can go ahead. Finish.
Yeah, and they talk about a women's party. The women's party that they have in the movie is not the women's party that we know of in the suffrage movement, which focused not on promoting people for office, but in pressuring the male-dominated parties to get women to vote. So that's not the National Women's Party.
Eleanor, are you done?
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Belinda.
Okay, so in viewing this film, I really took a lens of looking at it in the context of how the suffrage movement, how, for example, the women's movement have often had a particular narrative. If the suffrage movement over time has had a narrative that this film really exhibits. And that is that there's a concentration of viewing the suffrage movement as associated with middle-class white women. So really the theme, for example, of women having moral superiority is very much wedded to whiteness. It's also wedded to whiteness in the sense that the idea that women would have to stop working because they're married or because they have children was not something that in 1917 women of color enjoyed by and large, or even women who were from the working classes. So I think that it really does strongly have a narrative about the kind of framing of women's as white and what that meant, their frailties or their moral superiority, or perhaps their inability to, as in the film, she's torn between family and her husband and her job, and so she's ultimately sticking with what is kind of the moral decision of her job rather than the heart, which is also associated with really the freedom to be able to exercise that. I mean, the whole idea that a woman of color in that era would even imagine being a judge was just, I mean, it's just not something that you would even think about. So I think in that regard, it's very much race. And so I can talk more about some of this later, but I do want to say that there is plenty of research and work out there that really talks about the role of women of color during that period and their roles in the suffrage movement. Rosalind Terborg pens a book. She studied the roles of African American women in the suffrage movement, and really talks very much about just the number of Black women, for example, just to name a few, who really rallied and marched for women's suffrage. Frances Harper, Juno Pierce, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and the list goes on and on. Native American women who didn't even get the vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment also marched, as did Latinas. And so I think it's really important to think about it in that context. They often were relegated to the back of the march, denied the right to speak at these suffrage conferences. Some women who were very fair-skinned but African-American would sneak in. And so there's a long history of kind of the absence of inclusivity in this. And part of it is because when women joined the suffrage movement, many of them were already involved in their racial ethnic movements to begin with. And so the idea that those movements were separate was not really the framework in which they joined the suffrage movement. It was extension of their participation in those former movements, those race ethnicity movements, and that pattern replicates itself largely later in the early 1970s women's movement. So I would leave it at that because some of the questions that I know are coming up, I can add more to this information at that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Belinda. Virginia Kay.
Sure. So I will say I watched this movie and there is a lot to unpack from a modern day perspective. I will say there was a lot. It was, it struck me as being wildly progressive for the time, but yet completely anti-immigrant and xenophobic and, so many other things, and the complexity and how rare it was, I think, not just among white women, but as for women as a whole, the idea that a woman would not only ascend to leadership, but that a man would step back so that she would be able to have that position. And then beyond that, that she would then further move on to become governor, all while juggling being married and having a child and the complexity that exists today for many women, right? But it was just very, very interesting to me. I think even with it being a silent film and seeing the writing there, and it was interesting that the way they chose to write the words. You knew exactly who was speaking because they tried to do it in such a, it was just very anti-immigrant, right? Like anti-Italian, the language and the way that it was written on screen, which sat with you because you could almost hear in your mind the words being spoken, even though they were written. And so again, for me, there was a lot of complexity. I know we'll talk a lot about the 19th Amendment and women, and also this imaginary imaginary state out west somewhere. It just said out west. But the West, actually, I think Wyoming was the first state to allow women or grant women the right to vote. And so it makes sense that it would be in this state that was out west, It was just a very, I'm looking forward to this discussion because I think there's just, like I said, so much to unpack. So much of it is wildly unrealistic, but yet at the same time realistic in a modern day context. So this should be an interesting discussion for me.
Thanks, Virginia. I note we have a question already from one of our listeners about immigrants and the stereotype of Italians. And we still have the issue of immigrants today, not Italians, but others. Does anybody want to say at this point before we, as long as this has been brought up, about the issue of immigrants and the voting rights issue?
Yes, to put in context. We're here talking about European immigrants. European immigrants form a crucial part of the suffrage movement in the 1910s. Were it not for them, the movement could not have been a mass movement. So when we look at the giant parades, especially in New York, starting in about 1912, it is labor movements it is women in labor movements, women in the garment and textile industries who fill the ranks of the suffrage movement. There are a fair number of Irish and Eastern European, or Irish and Jewish women, Eastern European Jewish women, who surface in leadership roles. I'm not aware of any Italian women. It is said, well, there are a couple things. One is, whereas Jews brought in a socialist tradition, Italians brought in an anarchist tradition, therefore making them not all that interested in political participation. And the other thing is that it's interesting, it's not in the movie, but the Italians had a reputation for being very patriarchal. And that's not in the movie. There are actually no immigrant women, it's all men.
But I think it's interesting when you make the comparisons. And Belinda, given the fact that, you really do, focusing on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are really your area. But I think it's interesting when you think about the parallels today and how that anti-immigrant sentiment still exists and really impacts voting rights today and what we're seeing in our country and the othering of people. It's just a new form, what's old is new, and that it never really went away. And we see how the Latinx community is being marginalized. We saw a naturalization ceremony performed during the Republican National Convention. And the idea that many of those individuals had already come to the country and been doing the work and would not qualify as immigrants today to be able to even make it into the United States based on the new rules that have been put in place. And so I think, again, looking at a modern context and who is considered worthy of voting or who is worthy of American citizenship is really, really an interesting way to look at that piece of the movie, taking out the part about, women as a whole. And then so I'd just be interested to hear what your thoughts are.
No, I think, one of the things that has consistently happened, again, and this gets back to kind of the framing of white womanhood. And so, we have these immigrants who really seem to have no moral compass in the film. And there is a woman in there. You might have missed her. She's Italian. She's the wife of one of
the mother.
The bootlegger, and she's terrified of him. You get the impression he hits her. There is a movement that he makes in the silent film. She knows what's happened. She's terrified to speak up. Yes. So the idea then is that if we value our white women, and we know historically that when African American men, the idea was that they were going to get the ability to vote first over African American women. And there was this notion that, well, how can you have black men vote when your own white women can't vote? And so there was always this tension in the place of white women right next to that of white men. And again, this is very class-based, so I'm not just sweeping it all together. But it does become a piece of that narrative that, we're civilized and our white women are civilized, but yet these Italian men presumably, if they become citizens, would have votes over our decent, moral, wonderful, motherly, if she's pregnant, white women. And so we get that. It's everything is built in that regard. So, but yes, and that goes on today, right? We don't value that kind of the immigrant woman. The culture is always seen as backward somehow. That Latinx women don't have a vote, or different kinds of things that have happened around our politics as well, and that somehow we pigeonhole people in particular ways that serve to bolster and protect the superiority of middle class and upper class white men and women. And so I see it as just really a continuum over time, really, in that regard.
But you know what else? Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to say the ableism in the movie as well, which I thought was really interesting. You know, it's on display as though this token, the worst thing that had happened to this family was that this poor sister was blind. And, you know, and then the fact that somehow she was just, you know, completely disregarded as this liability within the family, but yet protected. Anyway, more to unpack. There's just so much there. So
I think the fact that the sister is blind, I tried to think about that, and then I thought, well, what else is supposed to be blind in the movie? Justice is blind. Is blind. I just would warn against reading the movie entirely on the grounds of discrimination and exclusion. It first of all, it sort of obscures the 100 years that goes on between then and now. And not to say that what's going on then or what's going on now is good. It just, I don't think, helps us to understand the movie in its own terms.
And Ellen, as long as we're on the subject of people of color and who is excluded, do you want to say anything more about the role of African American women in the suffrage movement?
No, I think Belinda's right. I agree with what she said. On the one hand, you know, look, the suffrage movement starts at the abolitionist period and then peaks in the Jim Crow period. That's a lot of difference. So those last 20 or 30 years, that's in some ways the worst period in American history for race outside of enslavement. So there's this, the suffrage movement happens at that moment. And I do not mean in any way to forgive those leaders who collaborated in marginalizing women of color. It wasn't all true. There were white women who were part of the NAACP in those years. But it is true that this is the Jim Crow years. The national government is controlled by Southern Democrats, and the national movement is taking place in a Southern white-dominated city. So these are people who are not just looking at their credentials for the future. They are trying to figure out, as political pragmatists, what they are going to do. So that's one thing. Then the other thing which Belinda talked about, which is absolutely right, is that Black women are involved in the suffrage movement from the beginning. By the turn of the 19th century, just a generation out of slavery, they're educated, they formed their own organizations, and they're probably more aware of what the vote might mean than any other group of women in the United States. So I think those 2 points, the historical context of the racism in the white suffrage movement and the presence of Black women in their own suffrage movement are the 2 sides of this story. Very important.
And am I right that the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote, and the suppression of votes of African American women was in the South, especially, and other minorities, was due to voter suppression tactics of those states? That is correct.
Well, of course, I would defer to Virginia. She knows this because the League of Women Voters is fighting voter suppression now. But absolutely, the 19th Amendment doesn't give anybody the vote. It just prohibits the states from disfranchising anybody by virtue of their sex. And what is the case then, and what is the case now, is that the states control the right to vote, and that is the problem. So when we talk about Black women lacking the right to vote after 1920, we're talking about the majority of Black women who live in southern states. And as Black women begin to move north into cities like Chicago and New York, there they begin to have a political role, right?
And let's return to the issue of the movie and its time and go back to Shelley and ask, how many movies of this sort were made? What were the variety of them? And how does this movie fit into an historical context of many other films of this sort?
I think the first really important thing to say is that the suffrage activists were incredibly savvy about visual media. They staged marches and parades and pageants that they knew would be photographed and filmed. And, as Belinda was saying, they were often a sort of display of white middle class femininity as particularly respectable. They dressed in white. The white women were prominent. But they were very, very savvy about using that kind of visual media. They also spoke in Nickelodeon movie theaters. They had slideshows and talked to audiences to recruit them for the cause. So they were very engaged with media. Suffrage activists were some of the first to record their speeches on sound film, very, very early sound films. And then, sort of at the height of the movement, the two national suffrage organizations fund and make feature films to promote their cause. So the Women's Political Union makes 80 Million Women Want Blank in 1913, and it opens with direct addresses by Harriet Stanton Blatch and the British activist Emily Pankhurst speaking to the camera. Now, these are silent films, but the image of these women addressing movie audiences was, I think, thought to be so profound and important. So that's 1913. Then 1914, the National American Women's Suffrage Association makes Your Girl and Mine, another feature film. They hire the screenwriter who has just written one of the most popular female-centric action-adventure serials of the time, and they ask him to write this movie. And it features a young white heroine who gets wrapped up in the cause for suffrage. And Dr. Anna Howard Shaw is in the film. And Dr. Anna Howard Shaw kind of takes the hand of the fictional heroine and shows her the way. So the suffrage groups really understood the power of film, up to and including making films. There were also tons of comic shorts that engaged with the women's suffrage movement because it was a huge topic of the day, right? And so some of these early comic shorts were pro-suffrage. Many were also anti-suffrage and lampooned the activists. So a sort of frequent trope would be to have, to suggest that the activists were mannish and have male actors in drag playing the suffrage activists. So Charlie Chaplin plays the suffrage activist in one film. And the other sort of favorite trope of these lampooning comedies was to play with kind of a future when women are granted the vote and where they imagined there would be complete gender inversion, like a horrific spectacle of gender inversion. So women on the police force and men taking care of babies as this kind of horrific future of not equality, but gender inversion, right? Just an inversion of the hierarchy. And so what's interesting about Mothers of Men is, so it comes into this debate relatively late in 1917. There's already been a lot of films about suffrage, but it takes this strategy of the comic shorts, which is to imagine this future, this horrific future, and it turns it on its head and says, okay, let's think about the future. Let's think about a future when women not only can vote, but hold elected office and serve as judges and state governors, and what would that be like? And so I think it's a really interesting entry into the whole debate. So like I say, it comes fairly late in the slew of suffrage films of this era, of the 1910s. But it does something a little differently. It doesn't actually advocate directly for the vote. It jumps and imagines a future in a very interesting way.
Okay, we have another question from Jing Peng about the issue of journalists in the film. There's a kind of a sense that the journalists are, the corrupt journalist editor is in league with the corrupt politicians and not going to be fair to the woman who is running for office and having to make a judgment on her husband. Do we still see journalism in a political position today, or how is the role of journalism playing into the politics of women's voting? Anybody? I'm thinking about Hillary Clinton and her friendliness and her emails and things like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at what's going on with Kamala Harris right now. And, you know, I mean, to be fair, not all of it is a product of the media per se. And journalism, I mean, such as it is, it's very divided, partisanship. So, but the framing of her is very stereotypical in many ways. And with at least from the particularly from the more Republican side of things, you know, that she's very angry, the most angry woman that he's ever seen. And what do we know as a stereotype of African American women is they're very angry. And if people think back, I was thinking about when Michelle Obama first came on the scene. She's cultivated a demeanor in a particular way. But initially that was the framing for her as well, very early on. And as far as Hillary Clinton, well, I mean, the whole idea that she didn't bake cookies was just seen as outrageous. That really stuck with people. That sounds really trivial, but it wasn't. I mean, it came up again and again and again that she didn't bake cookies. That was a statement she had made when she was first lady. So women have a hard time winning in the political arena because when you're really comparably assertive, we know that gets seen as like overly aggressive and angry, and you know. And then when you don't really stand up, then you're seen as too weak, that you're never going to be able to make it. And what kind of a leader would you make? You're going to cry. So it's very hard to navigate that even today, I feel. So,
Virginia, do you have anything to add to that? The portrayal of the role of journalism and the portrayal of women in politics, and in the film, the rhetoric is that women is too weak and too attached to domestic issues to be an effective leader in the public sphere. Do you think that attitude still exists today? And as the media, I mean, we do have right-wing media today, and we have a lot of different kind of a fragmented media landscape as opposed to the kind of mainstream media that we had in the past.
You know, I don't think we had mainstream media in the past.
Oh.
I think that's not true. I think in this period, most newspapers are either Republican or Democrat. They're openly and clearly partisan. And even the New York Times was a Republican newspaper. It couldn't be counted on to give a decent portrayal of Democratic candidates. So, you know, this idea that we have a distinguished, a past of distinguished newspaper coverage that somehow has been lost, I don't think it's true.
There are other issues that come up in the film that are considered women's issues, that they are tethered to concerns about home and family. And to turn that on its head, there was an article by Gail Collins in the New York Times, a terrible article, about the fact that women getting the vote should have led to more attention to women's issues like healthcare, education, and that sort of thing. Do you think that that is still a relevant issue, that women who got the vote did not pay attention to women's issues the way that they thought that it was thought that they would at that time?
I mean, I think one of the things that's difficult when you look contextually at the time is that, again, just because women fought hard for the right to vote. It's not like it was granted, it wasn't given. It was this hard fought battle that lasted over 72 years. And so I think who was able to vote and how decisions were made, it was still very much white, middle class and upper class women who were more suited to be able to address those issues. Why? Because they were homemakers. Many of them were domestic, working at home in a domestic capacity. And so think about who was able to vote when women could vote. If you're working 14 hours a day in a factory, you're not the one who has those very, very real issues. You're the one who's going to be least likely to be able to have access to the ballot, as opposed to women who maybe are in a different socioeconomic position, I think but I think today what you see, and it's not as though those issues didn't exist then, they very much did, is who was making the decisions about how to focus on policy and what policies needed to be put forward. I think today, though, when you think about what's happening, once again, women and women's issues should be at the center, and we are failing as a country. When you look at COVID and you look at the crisis, childcare, schooling, how many women are going to end up being left behind as a result, having to stop careers, or they're putting less hours towards their work just because they simply have to make those choices. And nobody is thinking from a policy level or focusing on what is happening to women right now in this moment, from both a mental health, healthcare, education standpoint, your ability to move forward in your job and to be able to progress in your career. All of these things are very interesting. And I think the other thing that's interesting about this film, just talking about all those issues, this is 1 year before the pandemic of 1918 hit as well. So again, what's old is still new. It's kind of like we're on this hamster wheel.
And I think it's interesting too that the film presents women's issues as a kind of opposing force, right? That Clara, the heroine, is kind of torn between the harpies of the Women's Party, who are just trying to push her forward into the governors, and who are not presented in any way sympathetic, and the pull of her family and her marriage. There's even a composition where she's trying to decide whether to run for governor, and the Women's Party women are on one side, and her father and mother and blind sister on the other side. And there's a sense that she's torn. Like, there's no sense that women's issues are part of a fabric of much larger issues, as Virginia Kase just saying, right? That they're seen in opposite. The film really presents them as opposite, and I think that's a problem with what it's doing.
And some of these women's issues, I think we can look at other countries and see that there have been more different advances in terms of healthcare, childcare, and I wonder why America has shown a different pattern there. Other thoughts about that? I mean, in Europe.
Well, yes.
Go ahead.
There was a famous article written in the late 19th century called "Why Is There No Socialism in the United States?" It is a very different country. First of all, there's a tradition of individualism, which is extremely strong in this country to this day. Second of all, there's a structure to our politics called federalism. We have, it seems odd to say this in the age of Trump, but we have a relatively weak federal government. And political power is divided between the states and the federal government. So when the Prime Minister of the Netherlands wants something done, he does it. That cannot happen in the United States. Just to repeat something I think I said before, I just called one of the heads of the electoral commission in Wisconsin and wanted to ask her about certain constraints on voting. Those constraints vary by county by county. So there's nothing like that, certainly in Europe. I think places like Canada and Latin American countries are a little bit more like us. But the structure of our politics is different than countries which, by the way, are smaller and less scattered.
Right.
Well, I would also say there's a history, I mean, that the feminist movement, there was internal struggles quite a bit over which way to go. There were liberal feminists, socialist feminists, radical feminists, all sorts of different viewpoints about the claims making. Ultimately, the liberal feminists won out in the sense that there was this idea that we were going to be equal to men, that we could lean in, we could be the same as men. And so that kind of approach really, for better or for worse, because there's multiple sides to this, but really led to this idea that women were going to fit into the existing structure, particularly of work. And if you look at patterns in some other countries, I take Norway because my husband is from Norway. They took an idea that we were going to take a more human perspective of which women were a part of that. And so we're going to really focus on issues of family, the collective good, and in fact ended up pretty much legislating that because women would take family leave and not men, that men had to take family leave. So there were steps. They have a quota system for like their boards for their companies. Where they have to have so many women, and then over time they don't need it anymore because it has kind of broken the barriers. We're much less prone to do that, and so some of that choice and kind of, I don't want to say ignoring physical difference because not everybody has kids or whatever, but the really kind of playing up that it's the same became more that women were going to have to fit into the man's world. Rather than really, in some ways, men having to address the other kinds of responsibilities and kind of the society as a whole. And so that has kind of reinforced, I think, some of the problems that we're still seeing with regard to the glass ceiling. As Virginia talked about, the other Virginia earlier about the fact that we're seeing COVID-19, just the pandemic is just, there are lots of articles, there are some studies out there now showing this is decimating women in terms of their careers. And the idea that somehow they're going to be able to get back on track is really up in the air at this point. So
we're coming to the end of our time, and I wonder if before we sign off, anyone would like to make a final statement. Ellen?
Question for Shelley. Would you call this, it's sort of a two-part question, a pro-suffrage film and a suffrage propaganda film? Do you think it was meant to, it's 1917. Do you think it's meant to change opinions?
I think it is. I think it's less direct than some of the other explicitly pro-suffrage films. I do know, I mentioned in my introduction that the producer, Hal Reid, was really interested to get the opinion of suffrage leaders in the East. And he screened a print for them. He wanted their input. He wanted the message to be applicable across the country. So I think it's a much less direct plea for women's suffrage than some of the other films which are explicitly asking for the vote. It's more of this kind of
Pretty
fantasy.
sophisticated.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the fact that the League of Women Voters took it up, immediately after ratification in 1921 and retitled it and showed it and went around with it. I mean, shows that they understood at the very beginning of that organization that this is an important film for their message, and it's an important message going forward. Right now that we've won the vote, how are we going to go forward? So absolutely.
Well, I want to conclude by thanking all of you, panelists, and thanks to all of you who joined us and listening to the panel. Now, let's all go out and persuade all of our friends and neighbors to exercise their right to vote in November.
So women currently vote at higher rates than men do, so let's remember that.
Let's keep it up.
Yep.
Okay, bye everyone. Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.